Recently, to get into the Halloween mood, I talked about dead trading card games. Games where the creators and designers just didn't have the funding or the foresight to keep the thing going. Today I wanted to keep this spooky train rolling and talk about dead Magic the Gathering formats. Hi, I'm Harrison, I run these here parts. You know formats. It's always a weird thing to explain to someone who doesn't play Magic the Gathering. Like if I talk to either of my parents about YouTube and I bring up Commander, they're just lost and I don't really know how to explain it. I should maybe watch what I say. My dad watches these videos sometimes. Everyone say hi to my dad down in the comments. Formats are the rules and restrictions put onto any given game or tournament. It's like a certain game mode. If you're familiar with Magic the Gathering enough that you are watching a video on YouTube about formats, you certainly know a few. You certainly know like Limited, which breaks down into draft, where you open up packs and you take a card out and then you pass it along. But then Limited also has Sealed, where you just crack a bunch of packs and play what you open. You also have other formats that are pretty well known, like Standard. Most high-end tournaments are Standard. It's a 60 card format and it only involves like the last couple of years worth of cards. And then there's the second biggest format in all of Magic the Gathering, in Commander. Some people like to say it's the biggest format, but that is a blatant lie. It's Kamigawa will block tiny leaders. Surely you know all of these, but if you've hung around Magic the Gathering long enough, you know of at least one or two other formats that have popped up and then disappeared just as fast. I have a list of 7 different types of formats that Magic the Gathering has. Every format in Magic should fit into these categories. I'm going to be covering mostly dead formats, but there are a bunch of other formats in here that still have dedicated fan bases. They're not completely dead, just mostly dead. The first group we've already covered. They're the formats that I feel like if you walked into almost any LGS, they should have a sanctioned event on the calendar for that format, ready to go. My first group beyond this is what I call Commander but X. I feel like every other fan-made format in Magic the Gathering is just some white guy with a podcast throwing out some of the worst takes you've ever heard, and then goes and says, oh yes, I'm making this format. It's Commander, but your commander needs to be ambidextrous, but you can't run a color with the letter E in it. But your deck needs to be 68 cards plus your commander. At this point, just play Commander and have like a Rule 0 discussion with your group before the game. The one that immediately comes to mind is Captain. Does anyone even really remember Captain? It feels like a fever dream. I don't actually believe more than like a dozen people ever played this format. Captain was a format made by a Commander YouTube channel that shall go unnamed for this video. It has nearly 300,000 subscribers, which is massive in terms of Magic the Gathering YouTube. The person running this channel decided that the Universes Beyond and including other IPs into Magic the Gathering was a line they were not willing to cross. They did not want them in Magic. So they made Captain, which was just Commander, except extending the ban list to include any card that had like the triangle on the bottom, or I guess any card that just included another IP. That's it. It kind of captured the anger at the moment that a lot of people had towards the Universes Beyond movement. This format didn't really take off at all. They tried to make a Discord for it, and within a day, literal actual Nazis took over, so they kind of had to abandon it real quick. A fun side anecdote that I might cut out of this video for Captain is I was pumping out deck techs when Captain became a format. It actually received a lot of press within the Magic the Gathering community, especially like Reddit and Discord. So when I made all these deck techs, I was like, well, it fits into Captain as well. So I went through all of my deck techs and added Captain at the end of it. But then the Nazi thing happened, and I was like, oh, I definitely do not want my name associated with this whatsoever. So I went through and deleted all the Captain parts. Sure hope I got all of them, but you could probably check. Yeah, when Nazis infiltrate your card game, I think at that point it kind of puts life into perspective, and you stop being mad at a game made for children. But there are a bunch of other formats that are just Commander, except slightly different. You better buckle in, this is like half of this video. Tiny Leaders is probably one of the most well-known dead formats. It was Commander, but everything is small. Your life total is 20, your deck is 50 cards, and every card you played had to be 3 mana or less. I remember a really funny thing about Tiny Leaders is that not every color combination had a eligible Tiny Leader. Blue, black, green did not have a commander. It does now, but that's after the fact. The solution at the time was you had like a token commander. I believe its mana cost was a blue, a black, and a green, and you got a 2/2. I don't think there's much more to it. Another attempt at a faster commander was Brawl. They released precons for this. There's actually a couple sitting back here. The Chulane and the Alila decks sitting back here. It was actually the first product that had Arcane Signet. Brawl was supposed to be the love child of Standard and Commander. It was singleton and multiplayer, but the decks were smaller and you had to stay with the standard rotation. So you really just took Commander, added the deck size restriction, and then added the worst part of Standard. The format still kind of lives on today. You can play it on Magic Arena, which is really the closest thing you can get to Commander on that vile app. And if you don't want to play Standard Brawl, you can play Historic Brawl. Historic is a format on Arena that lets you play any card they've put onto that game. So Historic Brawl is just Brawl, but you can play whatever. Factory Commander variants, there's Pauper Commander. Pauper as a format, you can only play commons. Pauper Commander, your 99 has to be commons, but your commander can be an uncommon. There are a couple extra rules on top of this that make it different from Commander. This feels like a format that would be fun if your Commander playgroup just felt stale and maybe you had extra time one week and you want to build an extra deck. But I feel like I'd just probably rather play Commander. Another format that is Commander but with a deck building construction laid on top of it is pre-EDH, or what I call Boomer Commander. The idea is that EDH was ruined by WotC when they started making Commander products and started making cards aimed at the format. So pre-EDH, you can only play cards that came out before the first Commander set. It might be fun to brew, but it has hardcore old man shakes fist at clouds energy. Also, I feel like a format that has no growth in its card pool is eventually just going to be really stale. Two Commander variants that I feel like have gained a lot of popularity over the last couple of years are Oathbreaker and CEDH. Oathbreaker is meant for similar vibes to Commander, it's just faster gameplay. You have a Planeswalker as your commander, but then you also have a signature spell. I feel like it's only a matter of time before WotC finds out some way to use signature spells in Commander. You have to control your commander to play it, but it's still really cool. Other than that, it's 60 card free-for-all in multiplayer. The other format that I was talking about was CEDH. It's competitive Commander, which might seem like a bit of an oxymoron, but I think it kind of makes sense. A big part of Commander is the social experience. It's the rules zero discussion you have before the game and what you expect to get out of it and where you draw the lines of what is a social faux pas and what isn't. Someone might think their deck is a 7 out of 10 when their deck's actually a 5 out of 10, and someone might think their deck is a 7 out of 10 when it's actually a 10 out of 10. If you start off with a different footing, things can get messy. That's why CEDH is so cool. You come to the game with the only preconceived notion is that you are going to want to kill your opponents and they are wanting to kill you. There are no hard feelings if I blow up your soul ring, because if our positions were swapped, you would have done it to me. I feel like I've been spending a long time on Commander, so let's lightning round these last few. Leviathan, Dual Commander, European Commander, Centurion are all practically the same format. They're all 1v1 competitive Commander. You guys would probably be in a better place if you just all unified. Which brings me to my next group. There can only be one. The Highlander formats. It's what Commander originally was. It was EDH, Elder Dragon Highlander. Highlander because you can only run one of each card, and there can only be one. Honestly, that batch of formats that I just mentioned are better off just melding into Canadian Highlander. It's a competitive 1v1 100 card singleton format. The main difference from Commander is that you don't have a commander. The fun thing about Canlander is that it has a points list, so rather than banning a card outright, it attributes a point value to it. You can only have 10 points in your deck, so you have to build in mind not to go over that limit. The group in charge of Canlander keeps an eye on new cards and existing cards and all the decks that are working through the format, so if something ends up being very powerful and very problematic, they can add points to it. Staying in Highlander, there's also Australian Highlander. Rather than 100 card, you're looking at 60 cards, but they also do the point system. Jumping to other formats that don't have these close ties to Commander, there are the budget mindful formats. The most popular is Pauper. It's a format where you can only play commons. It has enough support from bigger creators and has been around long enough. The format's more niche than like a standard or a commander, but it's definitely proven its staying power. From Pauper, you also have Peasant. It's like Pauper, but you can also run 5 uncommons as well. I think putting this odd rule almost feels a little jagged. Limiting the number of a type of card you can run feels a little too janky to me. It's like the Highlander points list. It might be a little awkward to police. What those other formats I mentioned earlier are to Commander, this is definitely to Pauper. Most of the time I feel like it'd just be easier to play Pauper. Another budget conscious format, probably the most budget conscious format, is Penny Dreadful. Penny Dreadful is a 60 card format where every card costs 1 cent. The format is pretty much exclusive to Magic Online, which makes sense because Magic Online cards can go for a lot cheaper than their paper counterparts. A big difference between paper Magic and then MTGO is that if you're looking for like jank cards that are under $1, if you go to your game store, that under $1, they usually might have like a bottom limit. It might be like, oh, the cheapest that you'll get is 10 cents, 25 cents, something around there. If you go on Magic Online, there's tons of cards that just go for a penny. And I mean tons of cards. Like, the majority of Magic is legal in Penny Dreadful. Of the 26,000 cards at Magic, 15,000 are legal in Penny Dreadful. You're probably thinking the same thing I thought when I saw this format. What happens if the card price goes up? There's a rotation built into the format. So every time a new set comes out, they wait for the dust to fall, so it's about a week after, and they check to see the prices. If a card is able to maintain for most of the time after that week under the 2-cent margin, it remains legal for the next rotation. It has that drawback like Standard where your deck might not be legal in a couple of weeks, but at least here you can buy a deck for less than $1. Let's move on to the next category, which I've labeled old. You might know Legacy and Vintage. They're pretty popular older formats. It's not uncommon to see cards like the Power 9 used here. The main difference is that one format will outright ban cards, the other format will restrict how many of a card you can run. There's also other formats like the format Pre-Modern. Modern as a format was 8th edition forward. They said this is where we're drawing the line, and all cards forward, you're allowed to use those. Pre-Modern, they said, all right, you do the line there, we're going backwards. It does draw a line on how far back it goes though, because it goes only back to 4th edition, because that's typically the line that Old School goes up to. There are different flavors of Old School, but Old School typically restricts the cards that you're allowed to play to the first couple of years of Magic the Gathering. Some are more hardcore and you can only play like 93 and 94, but some include 96 and 95. There's a kind of funny addition to this format in that you can play by the older rules as well. Since this is a casual format, it isn't necessarily always played in sanctioned events, so the exact rules that you follow depend on the tournament or just who you're playing. But it would be funny, just look at the old Mulligan rules and tell me that that wouldn't be just an awful experience. I mentioned old as a category, let's look at the category new. Like Modern, where they used the start of the new Magic the Gathering border to be the start of a new format, this has been done a couple times, namely Frontier and then also Pioneer. Frontier died out eventually, but Pioneer at least has the advantage of having WotC support on its side. I also think it's noteworthy to call the Arena exclusive formats new. I briefly talked about Historic. Historic is a format where you can play any card that has been put onto Magic Arena. There's also Historic Brawl, which is the format of Brawl, but you can use anything on Magic Arena. It's pretty much just a weak excuse to not have Commander on there yet. There's the format Explorer, which is just Magic's weak excuse for Pioneer. It's basically Historic, except you can't run the Alchemy cards. Speaking of which, Alchemy is Standard, but worse. The card pool is whatever it is in Standard, plus whatever Arena exclusive cards they've added since then. My final grouping of cards here is Funny Little Guys, because that is what I originally titled it in my file before I could think of the word miscellaneous. These are some of the more weird and creative formats. Like Dandan. Players play with a collective 80 card deck. Both you and your opponent play with the same deck. Most Dandan decks are built pretty similarly and include Dandan as the only creature, usually around 10 of them. There are a bunch of other instants and sorceries that are just tempo plays to slow your opponent down and change what's on top. It's also noteworthy that you only really have to keep track of 5 hit points since you're taking only 4 from Dandan over and over. So if you take 5 Dandan damage, you die. Speaking of format where you share your library, final format of the day is Judge's Tower. It's multiplayer, everyone has infinite mana, and their life totals restart every turn. You begin with 0 cards in your hand, and the whole point is that you have to play whatever you draw. You also have to activate all abilities that you have. And then if you have a creature that can attack, it has to attack. If your opponent has a creature that can block, they have to block. There is no choice, you must do all of that. The only way to win or lose in this game is by committing a rules infraction. For example, if you draw and then go to untap, you die. Both Judge's Tower and Dandan feel more like a cube experience, or like when you want to play something that isn't Magic but is also still Magic. They're really interesting, be fun to try them out. So after looking at all of these formats, what makes a format work? First and foremost, I think the support from WotC. If people selling the product aren't there to incentivize people to play these formats, they typically don't last too long. You have the odd outliers, but normally if a format doesn't get support from WotC, it dies off. Which is kind of tragic because WotC can be just super slow in responding to this. The problem that comes to mind is I talked about the commander for the Sultai Tiny Leaders deck. Well, WotC printed a Sultai Tiny Leader commander almost saying like, oh, this is for that format. But by the time they were able to print it, that format was long dead. And I think you also have to have game stores on board to be able to pull this off too. I think this goes both ways. Sometimes WotC puts out a format and tries to drum up excitement for it, and people just aren't there for it. I think a lot of formats that are just pitched as, hey, this is Commander, but you gotta wear a fancy hat, are always gonna be destined to fail because people would rather just play Commander and then wear a fancy hat if they wanted to. I've been Harrison. Now that this video is over, I'm no longer Harrison. I am free! Thanks for watching. As per usual, I will be responding to every comment this video gets for the first 24 hours that it's live. Don't forget to bolt your birds.